Alrighty, so what we have here is part 2 of the S76 Performance Operation Handbook. I've taken the pages out just so it's a bit easier to read. It's only a few pages. It is the flight planning data, section 1, and so on. Okay, so we'll go over this stuff in detail. So flight planning data, we start with aircraft fuel capacities usable. So really, we've got US gallons, liters, pounds, and kgs. Pounds is the ones that we care about, or the one that we care about. The maximum amount of usable fuel on the S76 is 1,850 pounds. All of your calculations for fuel will be done in pounds, so keep that in mind. There shouldn't be any questions that ask you about fuel in liters or gallons or so on. If in saying that, a lot of these calculators actually do have ways of converting, pre-programmed ways of converting, and we should be able to remember how to convert these anyway, but really pounds is the one that we're interested in. Standard tasks and fuel flows. So for standard flight plans, we'll be using a standard task of 140 knots most of the time, unless they say otherwise. So if they give you a flight scenario and it doesn't mention a TAS and it's a twin-engine flight scenario, so cruise, all weights, 2 engines operating, 140 knots is the TAS. 600 pounds an hour is your standard fuel flow, but keep in mind that this is only used when we're calculating mid-zone fuel weights, which we'll get into in a minute. We're not using this fuel flow to work out our leg fuel for the standard flight plan, only to work out the mid-zone fuel weight, which then allows us to figure out what the fuel flow is based on the chart on the other side of this page, which we'll get to in a minute. However, when we are looking at holding or single engine OEI operations, we are using the standard fuel flow from this page. So holding, all weights, 2 engines operating, 100 knots, TAS, and 480 pounds per hour. Really good to understand when you do and you don't use these numbers. So remember, 2 engine operating, standard standard flight plan, 140 knots, 600 pounds an hour for the mid-zone weight calculation. For all others, holding, all weights, 2 engine operating, 100 knots, 480 pounds per hour. And then we have the OEI, which can be a little bit tricky, but it's not too bad. So cruise and holding, all weights, OEI, which is 1 engine and operative. At ISA temperature, we are 420 pounds per hour. At ISA plus 20, we are 440 pounds per hour. So you can see they've made that easy. So ISA plus 20 is plus 20 pounds per hour. And you do need to interpolate that. So if you were given ISA plus 5, you would add 5 to the standard 420, so it would be 425. It also does count for ISA above 20, so this is not a cap, this is not a maximum. If you're given ISA plus 25, it would be 445 pounds per hour, and so on. And then your OEI TAS is always 100 knots. Standard fuel allowances for different things you'll do in a standard flight plan. So an instrument approach is 50 pounds. Startup and taxi is 40 pounds. And a rotor's running turnaround where, say, you are stopping, keeping the engines running, loading people off, and loading new people on is 80 pounds. All really good numbers to memorize. However, always refer back to this. When you're doing these calculations, if you're even slightly unsure, or even if you are sure, you always really want to verify that you're using the correct number, particularly when coming back to the OEI numbers. I always refer back to that one just to make sure I'm getting it right. Okay, mid-zone weights. A mid-zone weight is a calculated theoretical weight of the helicopter halfway through the flight, or at the distance mid-zone of a flight. It's not the real weight of the helicopter because we are basing this off of 600 pounds per hour. So let's look at this. Unless otherwise advised by a responsible company officer, the mid-zone weight versus fuel flow table, which is on the other side of this page, must be used to derive fuel flows for all sectors flown in two-engine operating. To determine the mid-zone weight, calculate fuel burn to the mid-zone halfway position of the entire flight at the standard rate and subtract this weight from the aircraft takeoff weight. This mid-zone weight derived will be used for all sectors. Enter the table at the appropriate density altitude, remember that, not altitude, but density altitude for each sector, and read the fuel flow for the sector from the corresponding weight column. Mid-zone weights are not required for OEI operations. Use standard fuel flows when calculating fuel requirements for sectors flown in the OEI configuration. So again, these two here, two-engine holding or cruise and holding OEI, you're using the standard fuel flows. For everything else, we're working out a fuel flow. So on this page, we have our fuel flow table. So at the top, these figures are for planning purposes only. The pilot in command must carefully monitor actual fuel flows to ensure that all statutory requirements are met. So this table has density altitude along the left, going from 1,000 to 8,000, and it's got weight along the top. And you can see that it's giving us both a fuel flow and a specific air range number, which we'll get to a bit later on. What we're looking at right now is the fuel flows. So, for instance, if we were at 10,000 pounds and at a density altitude of 8,000 feet, you can see that if our mid-zone weight was 10,000 pounds and we were at 8,000 feet density altitude, the fuel flow that we would use for planning would be 488 pounds per hour. A couple of things to note, which are here, is that when it comes to altitude, we want to round to the nearest 100 feet. So fuel flow figures for fractional altitudes to the nearest 100 feet must be derived by interpolation. Right, so that means we need to work out what it would be in the middle. So if it was at 7,500 feet, we would work out the difference between, if we were looking at a mid-zone weight of 10,800 pounds, we would look at the midway difference between 494 and 506, and so on. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky when you need to interpolate both the weights and the altitudes, density altitudes. Now, there are examples here on how to do that, which are quite useful. I'll let you go through that in your own because there is an example here, but we will do that more throughout the videos when we do a flight plan anyway. Now, weights, you do not round to the nearest 100, you round to the higher 250. So with density altitudes, we're rounding to the nearest 100. That means we could go up or down. But with weights, we're always rounding up to the nearest 250 pounds. So fuel flow for fractional weights to the nearest higher 250 must be derived by interpolation. Again, there is an example here. The climb. Initial climb to cruise level with two engines operating shall be conducted at 80 knots. Flight plan estimate shall be increased by 1 minute per 2,000 feet of climb or part thereof. When a destination requires an alternate, no allowance for climb shall be made when planning sectors from the destination to the alternate. Following an engine failure on takeoff, initial climb in the OEI configuration shall be conducted at VBROC, so velocity best rate of climb. Where the flight continues to the destination, the flight plan estimates shall be increased by 1 minute per 1,000 feet of climb or part thereof. So they're expecting OEI that you would be climbing at a slower rate. So they'll be doing 1 minute per 1,000 feet rather than 1 minute per 2,000 feet, which doubles the amount of time. Now, one thing that is not in here but I do know it to be true, is that you're always rounding up to the nearest 2,000 feet. So if we were climbing up to 2,000 feet, we would be adding 1 minute to our flight plan leg. If you're climbing up to 4,000 feet, you would be adding 2 minutes. However, if our cruise altitude was 2,500 feet, we are going to round up to the nearest 2,000, which is 4,000. So a climb to 2,500 feet would be adding 2 minutes to the flight plan, if that makes sense. And again, we'll go through that in detail when we actually go through a standard flight plan. Descent. Essentially, we're not doing anything for descent. Descent should be conducted at cruise speeds unless dictated by performance category for instrument approach or other limitations, e.g. undercarriage restrictions and so on. So I imagine they would say something in the question regarding your descent, and I haven't ever heard of that ever coming up. Calculation for the point of no return and critical point or equal time point. And this is very important. This section and this section, very important. So when planning flights over long distances greater than 180 nautical miles where no suitable en route alternates exist, and for all operations offshore, pilots must assess the options available to them in the event of an in-flight emergency. To this end, pilots shall, for the operations above, and other times at their own discretion, calculate a PNR and a CP ETP during pre-flight planning. In particular, the pilot in command should ensure there is sufficient fuel on board at takeoff to allow for flight with 2 engine operating to the CP ETP, OEI, and for OEI flight from the CP ETP OEI to a location suitable for an OEI landing, and be able to land with the appropriate fuel reserves intact. That's a bit of a mouthful, but basically what it's saying is that you need to make a calculation to be able to fly 2 engines out to your critical point, and then single engine beyond that, either to your destination or back to your point of departure. So you're working out an equal time point OEI. And again, we'll get into that in a lot of detail. This one's also a tricky bit. Where actual conditions vary significantly from anticipated conditions, both the PNR and critical point ETP shall be recalculated using actual conditions. Okay, again, very, very important. Very good to memorize this stuff, but when you need it, always use it as a reference, always come back to it. So these are our fuel reserves. So for a day VFR flight, we have a variable reserve and a fixed reserve. So difference is that the fixed reserve always needs to be the amount listed at any point in the flight. The variable reserve can change when we recalculate. So variable reserve in some situations is 10% and in some situations is 10 minutes. If, for instance, you are planning the flight before getting airborne, your 10% would be your 10% of the entire flight. If, however, you recalculated the flight halfway through because you were going to change your destination, that's now only 10% of where you're going from your present position to your new destination. So that's always going to change. However, your fixed reserve stays at what it is. So for instance, day VFR 2 engine is going to be 20 minutes. And regardless of whether you're planning at the beginning of your flight before it's commenced or halfway through, it's always going to be 20 minutes for 2 engines operating. So let's go through these. Variable reserve, 10% of the sum of cruise fuel required to reach the destination plus cruise fuel required to reach an alternate. So cruise plus alternate. Also keep in mind that that does also include your climb. So they're including the climb in your cruise fuel. So really in my mind, I think, well, there's 3 things I actually need to add. Climb plus cruise plus alternate for 10%. The fixed reserve, 2 engines operating, is 20 minutes. However, if we have an engine fail and we need to replan in the air, we only need a 10-minute a 10-minute fixed reserve because we're now OEI. For IFR and night, variable reserve again is 10% or 10 minutes, whichever is greater. So it could be that, let's say your 10% sum of your cruise fuel is only 50 pounds, but 10 minutes is something like 80 pounds. Well, then your variable reserve is going to be 80 pounds because your 10 minutes is greater than your 10%. Your fixed reserve for IFR and night VFR is 30 minutes, 2 engines, 10 minutes OEI. Something to take note is that all of the OEI fixed reserves are all the same, 10 minutes. Okay, IFR over water in VMC by day. Variable reserve is the same as your day VFR. It's 10% of your climb plus your cruise plus your alternate. And your fixed reserve, 2 engines, is 20 minutes, and your OEI is 10 minutes. So it's basically the same as day VFR. I'll just double check that. It looks to be exactly the same as day VFR. Calculation of fixed reserves, 2 engines operating. Fixed reserve shall be calculated at cruise fuel flow used in the flight. So never use that 600 pounds per hour to work out your fixed reserve unless the question specifically says to, which I doubt it ever would. So fixed reserve shall be calculated at the cruise fuel flow used for flight. Where the flight consists of multiple sectors, the fixed reserve shall be calculated using the cruise fuel flow for the final sector flown before landing. Where an alternate is planned, the fixed reserve shall be calculated using the cruise fuel flow for the final sector flown to the alternate. So in multi-leg flight plans, you might have different fuel flows because you might be flying at different altitudes. So it's saying for your standard flight, the fixed reserve shall be calculated using the cruise fuel flow for the final sector. So if you had a 2-leg sector, you'd be using the second leg sector flown before landing. Where an alternate is planned, the fixed reserve shall be calculated using the cruise fuel flow for the final sector flown to the alternate. So it's really the last leg regardless, and you'll see that when we do OEI calculations, it's the same. You're using the very last leg's fuel flow to work out your fixed reserve. Hope that makes sense. Last page. OEI. So, and this is just probably going to reiterate what I just said. OEI fixed reserves for all OEI operations shall be calculated at the OEI fuel flow used from the point of engine failure to landing. So there are some situations where you get a question where it says you are X number of miles along a certain flight, you have an engine failure, and they want you to work out your required fuel either to the destination or to an alternate from that point. So you would use your OEI fuel flow from that point to figure out your fixed reserve. Provisions for alternates offshore. Again, this is pretty important. The pilot in command must make provisions for flight to a suitable alternate. For any flight planned to an offshore platform, production facility, drilling ship, support vessel, or other marine landing platform. In the case of an aircraft which is conducting a Category A operation, such as suitable offshore facility may be nominated as an alternate. So basically what they're saying is if you're going to a rig or somewhere where you cannot guarantee a landing, that you must have an alternate. This requirement is based on the possibility of there arising in the course of the flight some situation which will preclude a safe landing on the destination oil rig or platform. Such situations might include gas or oil blowout, uncontained fire or other similar emergency, excessive pitch or roll or heave in the case of floating facility, weather conditions at the destination, an in-flight emergency which would render the aircraft incapable of carrying out a safe landing on the offshore rig or platform. So for instance, if you had an engine failure where you could no longer conduct a Category A landing, you can no longer land there and you must be able to fly to your alternate OEI. And you must plan for that from the beginning. In-flight revisions. So for any in-flight fuel planning or replanning, the same data as per flight planning is to be used. For the calculations of 2 engines operating cruise fuel flow, use the original flight plan mid-zone weight. In-flight recalculations of mid-zone weights are not permitted, or is not permitted, not required rather. For any in-flight fuel planning or replanning, the same fuel reserve, fuel allowances, and alternate requirements as per flight planning are applicable with the following exception. IFR and night VFR, the variable reserve, 10% only. So what this means is that if you are doing an in-flight revision and your IFR, you no longer have the or 10 minutes requirement, whichever is greater. So you can see here IFR and night VFR. Here it's got 10% only. If we look at here, we've got 10% or 10 minutes, whichever is greater. So an in-flight replan removes the 10 minutes, whichever is greater requirement. Okay, and that is the flight planning section of the operational handbook. So you can see that it's actually not too big. We've gone through that in 20 minutes. It's very important that you read through this in detail. For exam day, I would actually suggest reading this, having a good read of this before you hit the start button on the exam. You're given 3 hours for the exam. There is no requirement for you to hit start, at least that I've seen, for you to hit start prior to reading this. So what I would do is open this up. I normally write my cheat sheet notes down on the first piece of paper first, so there's a few calculations that I write out that I like to have visually rather than having to remember them. I've remembered how to write them down, but just having them there visually helps. So I write that out first. I have a read of any required documents. So in this case, it would be the flight planning material in the operational handbook. Find it, open it up, have it ready, have a skim through it, make sure they're the numbers that you expect. And if they're not, if they're different numbers to what we've studied with, it might pay to highlight them or circle them or something so that they're obvious to you. But have a read of that, and then you can hit start on the exam.